This week on the first three, we'll be taking a look at the state of LGBTQ plus anime. We'll look at a little bit of the history. We'll take a look at the current scene in Japan, and we'll take a look at a couple of shows. One dug out from the depths of history at this point, and one much more popular still to this day. All that and more this week's episode of The First Three. So if you're looking for queer narratives in Japan, there's really no better place than manga and anime. You can look back to the manga of the 70s, including Hagio Moto's The Heart of Thomas or Takemiya Keiko's The Song of Wind and Trees as kind of like early, shonen ai or like boys love kind of manga that then, in the case of The Song of Wind and Trees, was eventually adapted into an OVA in 1987. These narratives would be seen as kind of challenging the heteronormativity that had shaped a lot of Japan's cultural norms during the post-war period. Even in the lead up to the war, anything that was seen as homosexual was seen as kind of deviant and usually stamped out. So for a good run there was not a lot to challenge that norm. And so by the 60s and 70s, you start to see Japan's counterculture really pick up. And one of those first things that you see is like queer narratives in manga. And it's a good starting point for what we come to see in later years and now today, with a lot more openness about queer narratives in Japan. A lot of that earlier stuff is a little bit melodramatic. It's very big emotional moments, and like nowadays it comes off as a little bit tropey, but it was important work that needed to kind of establish that there were other ways to exist. It was also during this period in the, 80s, more so 80s and into the 90s, that we start to see a lot of the fan fiction starting to develop in Japan, with a lot of pairing of popular characters from bigger manga or anime at conventions like Comic Market, which at the time was a very small kind of local event in Tokyo there, before it really started to blow up. But in those kind of formative years of that event in the 80s and 90s there, you begin to see like a really strong female participation in the fandom there, and that opened up a lot of the queer narratives that you see in a lot of the fan fiction from that time. When we get into the 1990s, Japan's economic bubble bursts, and this causes a lot of soul-searching and hand-wringing, and those in power really wanted to try and solidify the family unit again. And so this kind of like blossoming counterculture and the queer narratives that were starting to kind of become not quite mainstream, but were definitely on the edges where people could see them. You found that the culture was kind of like regressing backwards a little bit, and so patriarchal kind of structures were providing the stability in uncertain times. And it wasn't until 1997, when we get the arrival of revolutionary girl Utena, that you see like a really big, bold kind of queer romance and battle story anime show up on the scene. Utena, of course directed by the legendary Ikuhara Kunihiko, challenged gender norms and was just all kinds of queer. So the focus on Tenjo Utena, who basically at every turn is refusing to kind of play the role of a typical, schoolgirl. She wants to be a prince, despite being told that she can't be one. She refuses to wear the female school uniform, much to the chagrin of the school's administration. And her relationship with Himemiya Anthi is the core relationship of the series. So it is a centered entirely around a lesbian romance, which, you know, at the time was a pretty big deal. And so it's no surprise that Utena has the kind of like cultural staying power that it does, and we still, talk about it to this day, is because it was a huge deal and it influenced a lot of creators going forward. Now, while Ikuhara was trying to elevate queerness and queer narratives through his work, uh, what ends up kind of happening in the 2000s, I would say, is that we don't really get a lot of like solid representation. Um, you've still got kind of like an OVA scene of like one off boys love manga that get really popular, and so they get a one shot kind of like 25-30 minute long thing. But a lot of those have the kind of problematic tropes associated with boys love. And on the other side of the coin, what you're getting is a lot of shows that feature girls kissing. So a lot of like Yuri kind of feeling anime start to appear in this period, and that's where we're going to get into our first show, which I dug out of the history vault here, and that is 2006's Shimoon. Now, this show came out at a time when there were seemed to be a lot of shows that featured like an all-female cast, and they either were all very much in love with each other, or at the very least were kind of hinting that there were feelings kind of bubbling beneath the surface there. Shows like My Hime or My Otome, Kanazuki no Miko, Yamito Boshi to Hon no Tabibito, Steel Angel Kurumi, Kyoshiro to Toa no Sora, or even something like Mahou Shoujo Ririko Nanoha. Um, all these shows kind of had that vibe to them. Some of them were in like a sci-fi setting, which, with a sci-fi setting, you can kind of like set the rules and you can kind of put your characters into whatever situation that you want. Others were a little bit more kind of toned down. Like Maria Watches Over Us was another one that was kind of like a more gentle kind of Yuri series, I guess. Um, but it was just a big thing where there were all of these shows that kind of had this queerness to them, but it felt like they couldn't quite escape the male gaze. Like, so unlike Utena, which had all of this kind of like thematic heft to it, um, these all girls shows from the mid 2000s don't seem to have as much conviction behind the themes that they're putting forth, which is why it feels a lot like fan service as opposed to kind of being something more revolutionary. And I say this knowing that Simoun actually has this kind of interesting quirk about the way its world works, that could seem like it's something progressive or a kind of like step forward in representation. And I think even on that front, it kind of falls flat. So let's get into the show itself. So Simoun is a very jargon-heavy kind of anime. Its sci-fi concepts are a bit much to kind of take in all at once, and they're kind of thrown at you in the first 3 episodes of the series. Basically, the way it breaks down is there's a war going on between the peaceful theocracy of Simulacrum, which is a very interesting name, and the industrialized nation of Argentum. Argentum wants to know the secret behind the Simoun technology that Simulacrum has. These are magical flying machines that are piloted by a pair of young girls who activate magical powers by, flying the Simoun in formations that are capable of generating all kinds of interesting effects that can take out huge swaths of enemies. So it's very OP kind of tech that this simulacrum theocracy is holding on to here. And we're kind of following the pilots of these Simoun Um, and the really interesting quirk about this world is that um, everyone is born female and then chooses which sex they wish to become at the age of 17. So your first thought is, oh, this is a kind of an interesting progressive kind of take, perhaps, that gender is something that isn't necessarily bound by a born sex identity. That there is like a freedom and a fluidity to it all, and you know, on its surface, kind of sounds good. But in practice, what we find is that it leads to then a reaffirming of the gender binary and leads to an adult world that is entirely heteronormative, where you have characters in the show saying that when they come of age, what they'll do is they'll, choose to be a man so that they can still be with their lover that they are with. And if we dig even further into this idea that once you come of age, then you just become straight, that has a history in Japanese literature going back to around like the 1910s, 1920s. There was a big kind of push on uh, the idea that, queerness could happen, but only when you were younger, when you weren't fully formed as an adult. And then once you're an adult, you become responsible and you become straight. Because a lot of homosexual content from that particular time period would be seen as obscene material and would not be published or promoted. It was very underground, if it existed at all. And so to kind of get around this and to explore queer narratives, authors would write stories of teenage love that could be read as very obviously queer in nature. But the story would always resolve itself as, oh, well, we drifted apart and then we got married and we had kids and yada, yada, yada. It turns out we were straight all along. And this idea really kind of took hold that youth was a time when you could experience these kind of things, but then, th- your straightness would kind of take over and, you would become a normal functioning adult or whatever. And it feels like a show like Simoun is using those kind of like codified themes of experimentation in youth, or kind of a queerness in that kind of formative stage of life, and isn't really trying to say anything more about the topic. It's kind of like using that framework really just as an out to feature kind of fan service material for the male audience. Okay, so let's actually get into Simoun a little bit more now. Uh, so, so no prologue business, no in media res little scene or anything like this. It gets right to the opening theme first, probably because this is one of the better animated parts of the show. We get a scene of two girls kissing right off the bat, so you know what kind of show you're getting here. It does help that this opening theme is a banger from Ishikawa Chiaki, the other half of Seesaw. So back in that time period, that was like a pretty good get. Her voice is excellent and really fits with the kind of sci-fi vibes going on with the show. It's an opening theme that is very heavy on just showing us every female cast member, and as they're all kind of like flying by the screen very quickly, it's basically a waifu for every taipu. So again, just kind of like laying out what kind of show this is and who it's for. So, the show opens up formally with kind of a long establishing shot of a post-apocalypse looking world, very drab, metallic, polluted looking place, and it's explaining the story of how Simulacrum came to be. Basically, that they had to flee to the Holy Land, as it were, away from people that didn't like them so much, I guess. They were declared demons for the Simoun technology, which they had obtained. And so everyone who's part of Simulacrum lives on this giant kind of floating ship. Uh, it's got these weird kind of like futuristic neoclassical vibes, so it kind of like looks old worldly, kind of ancient, Rome, Greece, that kind of thing, but with modern or futuristic even flourishes to it. So the show doesn't waste any time getting right into the action. Simulacrum is coming under attack, and so the girls have to sortie into their Simoun craft. So the Simouns are powered by a pair of girls, and we get a look at the kind of like main girl of this group, of the core Tempest group. It's Neveril, who is the pink-haired beauty who gets the first kind of like beauty shots of the show, and she steps up to her partner Amudia, and they deeply kiss. So, we've only been watching for, I think, maybe 2 minutes or so at this point, and we've already got our first lesbian encounter. So, the show's not wasting any time showing you kind of what to expect. Even though we don't get a lot of action on that front subsequently after that. So they're, I guess, hoping that everyone hangs around after seeing that one little kind of teaser that things might actually get spicy going forward. But the Simoun take flight, and these are some unfortunate CG relics of the past here. They do not look great, and their shape is very unusual. They're kind of like a gyroscopic looking kind of shell kind of thing. Not great. They don't really hold up too well. So the remaining pairs of girls also kind of kiss, but a little bit less dramatic than the first one that we see there. Everyone gets into their crafts. They take to the skies, and we learn about the formations that they fly in, the Ri-Majan. There are apparently hundreds of these different flight formations, patterns they can draw in the sky, and each one kind of creates a new magic spell of sorts. So the girls are calling out pattern names and performing them. This all looks like fine. Nothing really too much to complain about here. We get some like very brief introductions for some of the side characters here. So, whichever girl happens to be your favorite will at least get a line of dialogue, so you kind of get an idea of what they sound like and what their personality might be. So you can kind of start choosing your favorite Simoun wife, I guess. Now, one of the interesting things I found about this show was the background art. It has like an almost like 80s, 90s kind of like throwback feel to it. Like it's a big, solid hand-drawn cell in the background of all the shots here. And really flat, but like, not terrible. Like it's as an aesthetic, like kind of look to it. Like it was absolutely serviceable. And even though they were kind of like simple, they held up pretty well. The character designs also, were a bit spotty, but when they're done right, they look really good. It was kind of like a mixed bag of art styles and stuff with this show. I found between the CG crafts, the Simoun themselves, the character design, and then the background work, it all kind of doesn't quite blend the way you'd like it to, but it's interesting nonetheless. And this show comes to us from Studio Dean, who weren't necessarily known for consistent quality back in the day. Still perfectly serviceable studio for sure, though. I mean, they produced Higurashi, which is one of my absolute favorite shows. And even though a show like that in parts kind of looked a little bit janky at times, they do a lot of things right with, things like pacing and knowing where to allocate the resources when we don't need to have a character look super top notch. It's okay to kind of let them look a little bit, melty or whatever in the background. Like, okay, fine. You can tolerate that kind of stuff. And I think for the most part in Simoun, like it's the same kind of deal where some aspects of the art you're like, okay, that's kind of cheap, but when it counts, there are some really decent shots. Like I say, the backgrounds I found pretty charming, and a couple of like close-up shots of like eyes that were really well done. I noticed those definitely stood out to me. All these girls seem to have some kind of magic power kind of flowing through them, and as such it reflects in their eyes. And from time to time you get like a real close-up shot and really nicely done eye. So you take what you can get with a show like this. So the we're in the heat of battle here with the kind of invading force that seems to be always present in this show. They are always trying to get at the Simoun technology. It doesn't seem to end, and the battle kind of swings back and forth. But it's really just a showcase of the Simoun's power here. We're kind of being introduced to just how strong this technology is, and as such, it has to, uh, you know, really give us that feeling that this is really something that should be coveted in this world, and does a pretty good job. Although what we do get here is Neveril and Amuria do this kind of like super attack. It's Emerald something, I think is what they were calling it, and this unfortunately results in Amuria just eating it, just biting the dust. Um, and this causes Nevril to really spiral into this depressed little mini arc. It's revealed that in the aftermath of the battle that three of the girls have died, one of them being Amuria, and then two others. So, I mean, if your favorite waifu uh, ate it in the first episode, that's a real bummer. So everyone's kind of down in the dumps, and they're feeling the strain of this kind of never-ending war situation that they're faced with. And a number of girls are talking about how they'll be leaving to go to the spring, which is the place that they will go to make their gender decision. Um, as Once the girls turn 17, they're allowed to either just leave for the spring and then go on and be a civilian after that, or they can defer going to the spring and they can continue fighting for simulacrum. So whichever they choose. And so a lot of girls after this kind of latest tough battle are thinking that they might want to just opt out and head for the spring. But just as everyone is kind of all down and not really feeling it anymore, a new recruit shows up. A Genki kind of character, Aeru, and she is really excited to take on her new role as a Simoun pilot, and it kind of changes the mood of the place a little bit. And then that's kind of it for episode one. Really zooms along, lots of plot, heavy stuff, a lot of jargon, a lot of words get thrown out, and you're like, okay, I think I know what we're talking about here. But yeah, kind of getting a handle on what's going on here is a little bit difficult at first. But at least the ending theme is brought to us by Savage Genius, one of those like mid 2000s like flash in the pan, but delivered bangers pretty much every time they were on a show. So when you'd see them tied to a production, you were like, okay, well, at least the theme song is going to be decent. And so this one is also pretty good. So episode 2 kicks off, and there are more spy planes from the enemies that are trying to gather intel on the Simouns. So already we're kind of like right into another fight situation, and this is where Aeru is trying to make her mark, I guess. So Aeru just kind of hops into one of the training Simouns that they have, and takes down all of the spy planes. Now, what Neveril notices about Aeru's flying is that without even realizing it, Aeru has kind of pulled off the Emerald Re-Mahjong, so kind of one of the more advanced uh, techniques of flying the Simoun or whatever, and so Ayaru's got this kind of like natural talent, I guess, is what we're trying to show off here, and how this kind of piques Neveril's interest, even though she's still kind of down in the dumps about losing her partner. And this episode kind of serves as the kind of more local scale setting and world building. So we get Aeru getting kind of shown around what the different aspects of the kind of flying battleship that they're on is all about. And this is also where we get an explanation as to what the spring is in a little bit more detail, because one of the girls, Eri, has decided that she is going to go to the spring, and Neveril, being the kind of like leader of this group, is like, okay, well, I'll go with you to the spring, and so this gives them a lot of time to kind of talk over what the spring is and how it's like God's will to either make you a man or a woman, and whatever you kind of you can hope for the best, but you're not exactly guaranteed to come out of the process with the gender that you want to choose going forward. So it is kind of all up to Tempus Spatium's will or something. So that gets thrown around a lot. It's interesting here that Eri, who is making the choice at the spring, isn't entirely sure which way they kind of want to go with this. She thinks that she might want to be a man for various reasons of job security and kind of what the role might entail in that society. And it seems like it's a very patriarchal society, so being a man would have kind of those benefits. But she thinks, well, I've been a girl all my life, and so do I want to be a woman when I change over here? And then we get a scene of Eri walking into the spring. It's kind of it's an interesting couple of shots here, and then we get a hard cut to outside the spring, and Eri is now Aerith. She has been kind of reborn, or the god has willed that she will be a man going forward, and this kind of scares her, in fact, and she breaks down in tears, and Neveril tries to comfort her. It's hard to kind of get a sense of what this scene is trying to say to us, the viewer here. Eri kind of seems to regret her decision to come to the spring to, kind of start her life as a man. I mean, this could be taken very negatively, pulled out of context to say that, that she's regretted transitioning, which is a hot topic these days. And, that kind of sends like a bad message on that front. So it's kind of like a thoroughly confusing introduction to this whole concept of choosing your gender when you come of age. So it kind of like makes our first encounter with this concept to be like a very strange one, one that seems to be filled with nothing but suffering for these girls here. There isn't any kind of element of positivity about having chosen a gender that you believe in or anything like this, and so it leaves a really kind of strange echo kind of going through this whole series from here on, where you're like, this is something that should be interesting, and yet it's kind of like hanging over everybody this whole time, as opposed to being something that could be shaped more positively. Alrighty, so in episode 3, this is basically the selecting new pairs episode. So after the losses of the last battle against the enemy forces, and with the departure of Eri, what we've got is kind of this gap in a lot of the pairings. And so there's a big ceremony that is part of pair selection, and there's just kind of like a lot of back and forth between all the different girls here who are all jockeying for certain people that they like, people that they have crushes on, people that think they could work well together with. So that's kind of the driving force of this third episode. And I think it's trying to lead towards either setting up Aeru and Neveril as like a pair, like as the main pair, or kind of setting them up potentially to be as kind of like rivals, or having different philosophies on the battling and the whole Simoun technology and the use of the uh, kind of air glyphs, I guess they are, that make up their formations or whatever. Meanwhile, in the background, there's kind of like this constant din of war going on. The enemy forces are like always nearby. They're kind of lobbing shots at the simulacrum battleship. So this idea that they can kind of like never escape the fighting is kind of well done in that the enemy always feels like they are close and uh, trying to gain access to the Simoun technology, but at least in these first three episodes, their motivation, the enemy's motivation, is never really expanded upon other than that they want the technology. So it doesn't really do much for who this kind of, counter force is. Uh, but they're just kind of this blank slate at this point in the show in the first three episodes. So, if you're just watching these first few to kind of get a sense of what the show is like, you're left hanging on that front for sure. Now, the Simoun pilots aren't alone out here. There are a few adults who seem to be kind of like running the show, and none of them at this point are putting off like bad vibes or anything, but you can't help but think that they're not working in the best interest of the Simoun girls who are giving their lives to fight this war. But they're left pretty ambivalent at this point, and they spout a lot of philosophy jargon and stuff, and they talk about their faith and what all of that means, but again, kind of like vague and strange and distant, and so we don't really get too strong a sense of like what their motivation is either. We've got a bunch of cute or pretty looking girls who are the instruments of war here, and by this point you have heard enough from each of them to kind of maybe make a pick as to which one you like the best. I think, it's such a weird show, but it feels like it really was of that time, and that there were a bunch of shows that kind of had the same vibes to them. All of them get labeled as Yuri, so you've got some expectation that there's going to be some love or longing between female characters in it, but these shows, unlike a couple of Yuri shows that you would see nowadays, these ones don't have any kind of like real weight to the relationships or anything like that. You're not really seeing these girls as being like real queer people in the world. They're just kind of like living in this strange sci-fi setting where they have to kiss to operate these machines to fight a war, and like that's it. And you just are waiting for them to hop into the Simouns and kiss, and then that's what you get, and there's a couple of kind of fan servicey shots here and there, but you know when the end result, especially of a show like this one, is that everyone basically becomes straight, and all of these relationships that they have are meaningless once they turn 17 and they visit the spring. It kind of like lessens any kind of impact that they might have, especially when there isn't anything in the writing to suggest that there is more of a message behind what's going on. It really is just to titillate the male fan base for a show like this. So that's Simoun in a nutshell, I guess. Kind of a relic of a lost era of not exactly representation in any kind of meaningful way, but girls do kiss and they declare their love for one another, so I guess that's something. But like it wasn't really until I'd say like the late 2000s that you start to see a little bit of a shift in what Yuri could be in an anime production at least, like where they were greenlighting a series that was kind of diving into more kind of like lesbian themes as opposed to just being this kind of fluffy fan service kind of material. I'm thinking of like Aoi Hana, like the Sweet Blue Flowers, that was around 2009. That was one of the first shows that I had seen where I was like, oh, this feels like something different, even though it's kind of following the same will they, won't they kind of vibes of some of the other shows that came before it. This was one where you're like, okay, this is a step in the right direction. But yeah, Simoun, really mixed bag of sci-fi jargon, an interesting concept when it came to the choosing your gender at 17, just executed poorly, unfortunately, and a kind of limited animation budget uh, really detracted from what could have been like a series that at times looked pretty decent, but more often than not fell victim to just having to cut corners and suffered from that. So I don't know if you're interested in looking back at kind of a weird series from the 2000s that kind of had some Yuri vibes to it. Like you could probably do worse. But yeah, this one really kind of strikes me as very of its time, and nothing really too special. So the second show that we're going to look at really needs no introduction, as it was a huge hit, both in Japan and globally. Um, by 2016, you're starting to see kind of like the tide shift towards queer narratives that are much more grounded and less filled with the kind of more tragic or toxic tropes that seem to uh, make up the bulk of queer narratives prior to this period. And I think all of this came about as a result of studios and production companies finally realizing that uh, female fan bases make up a good chunk of the viewing audience. And when it comes to fan creation at events like Comic Market, the split is almost 50-50, if not favoring women more so now when it comes to who is participating as a seller, and even in the attendees themselves. Um, and so it's kind of a double-edged sword in that it's getting us towards more representation, but also businesses kind of capitalizing on a sector of the market that they had been undervaluing for far too long. So, you have to take the good with the bad, I guess. And even though it is kind of driven by profit, the fact that we get to see more shows produced with queer narratives, I think is a net positive that we can kind of work with. So a worthwhile trade-off, I would say. And so of course we're talking about Yuri on Ice, which was 2016's runaway hit. Yuri on Ice dominates the fan scene for years after the show airs. It's pretty nuts. I was in Japan talking to uh, doujinshi artists in 2018, and overwhelmingly the number one series was still Yuri on Ice, even though there's a plethora of shows that kind of fans gravitate towards for when they're creating their fan-made works. Yuri on Ice was still hugely popular even then. And I think remains to this day one of the bigger categories still, as fans wait for the movie that is still in limbo, I think, at this point. No real updates on that one for quite a while now, unfortunately. But yeah, Yuri on Ice was a sensation, both in Japan and internationally. Just huge hit. It was handled by Studio Mappa, so a little earlier on in their run, I guess. Now they're just this juggernaut who does anything and everything, but that was when they were still just kind of a little more selective with their properties, and so this was kind of a shot in the dark for them, and really paid off with a great team kind of working on the project as well. And what this show really felt like was a recognition of all of the years of fandom, of people pairing characters together, writing queer fan fiction, and being kind of validated on the big stage with a production that said, "Yeah, we're gonna ship our two main characters. We're gonna go as far as they're gonna let us go here." So, how does Yuri on Ice hold up when put to the first three test? Turns out, does a pretty good job. So the show kicks off with the opening theme, this kind of trumpeting pomp and circumstance kind of theme brought to us by Dean Fujioka that it perfectly fits in with kind of like a Winter Olympics figure skating kind of feel and is backed up with some really impressive skating animation going on. So sets a high bar right off the start, which is cool. We open on the Grand Prix finals, one of the major events on the figure skating calendar, and the acclaimed skater Viktor Nikiforov has just won the gold medal and is contemplating retirement. Meanwhile, the nervous bundle of energy that is Katsuki Yuri, our main character, was a bit off his game, and the commentary wonders if perhaps he might be washed. Yuri retreats to a washroom to call home, and it's a really kind of great claustrophobic shot of Yuri in the stall, and it kind of brings us into the scene and makes us feel that kind of pent up, nervous, anxious energy that Yuri is feeling. He gets interrupted by another figure skater, Yuri Plisetsky, who is the winner of the junior Grand Prix final. And his intro is really good. It makes a strong character statement here. It's very stylish, and it contrasts with Yuri's kind of nervousness. Yuri is this kind of like snarky little kid with a lot of confidence. Having somewhat tanked his performance here at the Grand Prix finals, Yuri is not in great spirits, but in the kind of post-event hustle and bustle on his way out of the event space, Yuri happens to see Victor walk past, and Victor being his longtime idol, he's hoping to maybe speak with him, but as Victor politely, or perhaps it's a slight dig, asks Yuri if he would like a kind of a commemorative photo to mark the occasion. Yuri gets all out of sorts and flees, realizing that maybe he was kind of foolish for wanting to meet his idol so badly. We then get a big ol' flash forward 1 year later to Hasetsu in Kyushu. This is a not a real place, but it is based on a real place, and it really shows. There's a lot of great establishing shots of this little town that are very clearly inspired from real locations around the real city of Karatsu. So Yuri is returning home for the first time in quite a while, and he meets up with his teacher, Minako Sensei, who greets him at the station, and she kind of talks about what the state of Hasetsu is at this time. Less kids are interested in the ballet classes, less kids are skating, people are moving to the big cities. So it's got all those kind of thematic elements that make up a lot of these like small town Japan anime. Yuri is pretty anxious about returning home. He's kind of like the hometown hero, and he feels like he's let everybody down. So, when people come up to him and they're trying to show their support, he's very, nervous about this because he feels like he's really let everybody in Hasetsu down. So, it makes him an immediately kind of like likable and relatable protagonist. Does a good job of getting the viewer on his side, in that sense. So his family runs an onsen called the Utopia, which I think is pretty funny. U being the, well, a word that's used for to describe hot water or a hot spring of some kind. So the kind of the play on words there was kind of funny. And again, another like shot that's very clearly a has a real world reference in it. Really nice little shot of the entrance to the onsen. Clearly, someone took a photo of a spot that they had found in Karatsu and wanted to put it into the show. So a lot of those kind of shots are in this series, and you do notice them, and they're very cool. So Yuri is coming home because he's really at a loss for what to do. So he takes to the local rink to skate for a bit, where he runs into his childhood friend Yu-chan. A little bit of a flashback to them growing up, and they're in skating lessons together. Um, Meanwhile, we're cutting to Victor going for gold at the World Championships. So there's this kind of contrast of Victor still on a roll, and Yuri just skating to an empty crowd. I guess there's no one at the local rink, and this is where we get our first look at some of the skating animation in action, and it does look pretty good, all things considered. I think that the team did an excellent job of bringing the kind of the dynamic aspects of figure skating to life here. The jumps look pretty good. I don't really know a whole lot about figure skating, but everything looks pretty crisp and well animated. At times, the skating appears to be a little bit detached from the ice surface itself. The got the friction just a little bit wrong, but and sometimes the perspective gets a little bit wonky. It there's a bit of off scale stuff going on here, but I mean, all in all, it looks pretty good. So you can generally kind of forgive it because the effort being made there is pretty significant, and it does, on the whole, look pretty good. So big upside if you're going to be featuring a sport in your anime, it's got to look pretty good, and Yuri on Ice does do that, and that's consistent throughout the series. I don't think they really skimp on the uh, skating too much. I think there's a couple of recycled animations from time to time, but for the most part, it all looks pretty cool. So Yuri skates one of Victor's routines, and unbeknownst to him, this gets recorded by Yu-chan's kids, who then upload it to social media of some sort, and then the Yuri's copy of Victor's program goes viral. Um, and then all of a sudden we get word that an attractive foreigner has shown up in town and is there at the onsen. And to Yuri's shock, it's Victor who appears. He's in Hasetsu and he wants to coach Yuri. The episode's got a nice pace to it. It really kind of keeps things moving along, and it is very much focused on Yuri and where he is mentally. We want to get kind of invested in him early on, and so this is, showing his kind of disappointment at his performance in the Grand Prix final, and then kind of we get to know about what his life is like, and now that he's chosen to perhaps give up skating, what does that look like for him? What does that mean for him? How does he go home and face his family? So a lot of investment in Yuri, with only kind of like this little sprinkling of the other characters that are going to factor in Victor and the Russian Yuri. So episode 2 starts off with a little flashback to Victor leaving Russia for Japan, and how this decision is starting to make its way through the skating community, and people are thinking, oh, so Victor's definitely retiring. And it was the viral video of Yuri's skate that kind of convinced Victor that he wanted to make his way to Hasetsu to coach Yuri. We then flip back real quickly to Russia, and Yuri Plisetsky, the young punk, hearing the news that Victor is taking off to Japan, becomes quite incensed because he had been hoping that Victor would coach him instead. And it's here that I realize that all of Yuri's scenes are played with this like noisy, feedback riddled electric guitar bits. So like really ramping up his like edgy emo kind of character vibes, which I thought was pretty smart. It's a good character theme. So Victor's kind of being really casual. He's living it up at the onsen, chowing down on the katsudon that the joint is famous for, and talks to Yuri kind of about what his coaching style is going to be like. And it's here that we really get to experience kind of like what Victor's energy is like. And boy, it is pretty overtly sexual. He's voiced by Junichi Suabe, who has like the perfect, like deep, sexy guy kind of voice for this role. And Victor's walking around the onsen with his like short robe that always seems to be like slipping off of him, kind of like revealing little bits of skin and stuff. And like it's all way too much for Yuri to handle. The team at Mappa definitely did a really good job of making sure that like Victor is always looking like impossibly handsome. Um, so you can really see why like Yuri starts to fall for him. You know, he's just this like super ikemen guy that no one can resist. So it drawing him to be so handsome and then having everyone in the world of Yuri on Ice be completely smitten with him, it's fully believable. Alrighty, so after laying down the ground rules for what the training is going to look like going forward, if Victor is going to coach Yuri, they head down to the local rink, which is the Ice Castle Hasetsu, which is just a very cute name. And they set up shop to practice, and we get a little bit more backstory on how Victor was already the number one skater in the world, and how Yuri looked up to him, and Yu-chan and her family are all kind of there at the arena, and they're all really stoked to see Victor there in person. But unfortunately, press also finds out that Victor is here in town, and they swarm the joint. So a lot of chaos with the press and whatnot. And meanwhile, we kind of just get this Yuri training montage as he kind of gets himself back into shape after kind of neglecting his routines over the last year or so. This is also when Yuri Plisetsky shows up, and the two Yuris are going to compete for Victor's time in a big ol' showdown at the Ice Castle. But before that happens, we return to the onsen, where Yuri Plisetsky will also be staying. The Yuri kind of name confusion is a bit much for Yuri's family, and so they decide to give Plisetsky the nickname of Yurio to differentiate the two, which is like a cute little version of his name, I guess, and Victor likes to poke fun at this. So the next day, Victor introduces Yuri and Yurio to the music that they'll be performing to, and they're two kind of like different takes on the same piece of music, and as such, they have very different vibes. And both Yuri and Yurio are pretty sure which one they would like to perform to, but Victor, of course, switches it up and gets them to perform with the music that doesn't quite suit their personality necessarily, but might be able to, coax something out of his, potential students here. So that's it for episode 2 there, and it does a good job of kind of bringing in more characters into the mix, slowly kind of expanding that world, and starting to move the plot a little bit at least, so let's just keep on rolling through into episode 3 here. So here Victor shows off what each of these programs will look like, Agape and Eros. So Yurio is going to be taking on Agape, which is kind of this more unconditional love is kind of the theme, whereas Yuri is going to be performing Eros, which is more of a passionate desire kind of love. And Yuri is just not ready for this. You can tell he's very uncertain of his ability to project this kind of erotic and sensual kind of performance that Victor is looking to get out of him. There are definitely a lot of shots that are kind of like, suggestively set. We've got a lot of between the leg shots. We've got a lot of focuses on butts and stuff. So the direction is definitely teasing the potential relationship between Victor and Yuri, even at this early stage. Director Sayo Yamamoto wants you to keep kind of thinking about this relationship that's building here, and is doing so with some, very nicely done shots. So here we get a little bit of Yuri's anxiety and lack of confidence kind of coming through here. He's not sure if he can pull off this routine. He also talks to Victor about how he can't land the quad Salchow in competition. And Victor says that as his coach, it will be his job to give Yuri that confidence. And then he gets all close to Yuri and makes him all flustered and nervous and stuff. So another kind of moment where the tension kind of gets ratcheted up in the relationship between Victor and Yuri that is blossoming here. So here we get a little practice montage again. Yuri talking to Yuri-O about what he might be able to do to land the quad that he's trying to hit. And Yuri-O at first being pretty prickly, as he's wont to do. It's well established at this point that he's kind of this punk ass. But maybe hints of a bit of a softer side. He decides to try and help Yuri get over this hump here with trying to land this jump. So while Yuri-O's doing a pretty good job with the routine, the agape that he's been saddled with, Yuri is still kind of struggling with trying to get this Eros theme kind of down. And a detail that I had forgotten about was that Victor had told Yuri to try and, find something that he was deeply passionate about, something that he truly desired to kind of serve as an inspiration to get there with this Eros routine. And I completely forgot that Yuri starts imagining a Katsudon as kind of this object of desire for him. So a lot of lines about how he's going to show Victor the Eros of the Katsudon, which just very funny. So we get to the big competition. It looks like Yuri-O and Yuri are making progress here. And then we get this little moment between Yuri and his former coach slash teacher, Minako Sensei, where Yuri goes to her for advice on how to move more feminine. Because unlike Victor, who when performing the Eros routine for Yuri, does it with a real kind of like sexy playboy kind of vibe to it, Yuri doesn't feel like he can pull that off, and that it's more natural for him to kind of move in a more feminine manner, perhaps, and that would be his preferred way of expressing this kind of, erotic, sexual kind of energy, which is interesting. An interesting thing that Yuri realizes about himself here. The episode ends with Yuri winning the little competition. Yuri-O takes off in disgust, but he does vow to win the Grand Prix finals this year. So setting up kind of like what the long-term narrative is going to be, in that it's all going to kind of culminate at the Grand Prix finals again. Yuri-O is established now as the kind of rival to Yuri, and we'll see, that big showdown kind of at the end point of the series. So that's kind of being telegraphed here. And the kind of relationship between Yuri and Victor is starting to build. So you've got kind of all these elements that have been set in place, and by the end of the third episode here, you can kind of see where the series is going to go from here. Yuri and Victor are going to work together. We're going to, make our way towards the Grand Prix final, which means performing, in some smaller events along the way. Yuri-O is going to be the big bad at the end, I guess. So, a very solid first three episodes that does a good job of kind of establishing everything that this show is going to be and what you can kind of expect going forward. So, does a really good job of giving you enough to make a judgment call on. So, is Yuri on Ice good? Yeah, it definitely is. Um, it is this like kind of evolution of boys love stuff. It's a very more grounded and realistic relationship between Victor and Yuri that builds over the course of the series. Uh, it's a sports anime as well, and that kind of is another reason for people to want to watch the show. It does a good job of uh, portraying the sport that it does, even if figure skating isn't the sport that you might normally watch. It does a great job of bringing it to life in animation, and as such, it makes it more engaging as a viewer to watch. So, for all intents and purposes, while Yuri on Ice was and is still like a fairly big hit when it comes to queer representation in anime. Um, what I find interesting is that you haven't seen like a lot of shows since then that have been quite as big a phenomenon. And you would think that by now something would have come along that would have been even bigger or just as big and just as popular because you can't really get away from Yuri on Ice. Like even to this day, it's still there's a huge fan community that are still making fan made works for the series. There is still a movie looming. It's somewhere in production. It seems to be kind of lost at this time, and unfortunately, it is kind of tying up Sayo Yamamoto, the director of the series. She's been tagged to do this movie, and it's nowhere. And she hasn't been given any work since, which is honestly a little bit strange. I know that she has been more vocal than most people when it comes to how much pushback she got from the studio when making Yuri on Ice, because there are a couple moments that are like just somewhat censored as the show goes on, including a kiss between Yuri and Victor that is, we're watching it and you can kind of put it together that it happens, but she wanted it to be much more, obvious and upfront and kind of this big moment. And she was forced to kind of pull back a little bit. And she was vocal about these kind of changes that the production company wanted to make. And I don't know, it seems just kind of weird that this, very talented director who her track record is on the three shows that she has worked on has been great. A steady kind of uh, rise up, I suppose. She started off in 2008 with Michiko and Hachin, then took on a take on the Lupin the Third series, focusing on Fujiko Mine's character. And this was a really stylish, very cool series from 2012. And then she gets this Yuri on Ice project in 2016, and it is one of the biggest hits in anime. It topped sales. It has huge fan involvement. For all intents and purposes, it's a hit. It's a runaway hit of a show, and that was 6 years ago now. And so they've kind of like tied her to this movie that is doesn't seem like it's going to ever be made, or if it is, they're waiting for like the hype to die down for Yuri, and then release it maybe, and then say, well, look, it kind of bombed or something. Like, I don't know. It just feels like they've kind of stuck her in purgatory, which doesn't seem very fair. But also kind of speaks to where Japan is with regards to like LGBTQ plus representation. Like there's these big moments that hit, and then they're just kind of like pulled back. Just enough by that kind of like conservative politics that makes up a lot of Japan's cultural scene. So while we have, great shows like Gundam Witch from Mercury, And one of my favorite films, Stranger by the Shore, which is just an excellent kind of film. And these are productions that look really good. They center queer relationships, and it just feels like I don't know if they're being sanitized a little bit or just not being able to be fully expressive or going all the way out into the mainstream, but something is holding all of this stuff back just a little bit. And even though like the tide does seem to be turning in Japan with regards to LGBTQ plus rights and same-sex marriage is looking like it's close to being a thing in Japan finally. Yuri on Ice really should have opened the floodgates. And, while there is more queer anime and manga out there now, it's not making quite the cultural impact that I think it should be. And while we're like more willing to celebrate a show like Yuri on Ice here in the West, fandom in Japan tends to kind of go underground a little bit. And so you go to events. I was in Japan in 2018, and so Yuri on Ice was still a really hot property. And I would be speaking with some female creators of doujinshi, or like fan-made comics, basically. And when they talk about their fandom and what it meant to them, it was really coming from a place of passion. But the kind of like other side of it was that they didn't want anybody else to know about this. If I was going to, write something about an artist that I had been speaking with, they wanted to make sure that they could remain anonymous because they wouldn't want their coworkers to find out that they were into this kind of stuff, or their family members even. So there's still this kind of like stigma about like queerness, I guess, in Japan that has yet to be addressed in any meaningful way. So as much as there's more shows that are being produced like this, if everyone's too scared to talk about them, then there's just not going to be any progress. So hopefully things can improve soon, and hopefully Sayo Yamamoto can be freed from her Yuri on Ice prison so that she can maybe head another amazing series and kind of, knock another one out of the park. Because, I think we're missing her talent out there in the world. Alrighty. Well, that, I think, is going to wrap it up for this week's episode. We took a look at a couple of shows, one older, one a little bit newer, looking at trying to see if the kind of LGBTQ plus representation is looking a little bit better these days, and I gotta say it definitely does. Shows like Simoun felt like they were like a dime a dozen back in the mid-2000s there. I don't think they actually were, but they were the Yuri content of the time, and just didn't really reflect any kind of actual queerness in any kind of way other than to serve as fan service. So what we're seeing is definitely some improvements in that regard here. Yuri on Ice, definitely deserving of all the praise that it gets. It looks good. The central relationship is solid, and definitely see why it took off and was such a huge hit. So that's going to do it for this week's episode. Thanks for tuning in, and next week I think I might try and tackle Oshinoko. Kind of a huge hit, and kind of a weird one in that it started off with a full-length movie that you had to watch for a first episode, making it a very interesting first three kind of case. So we'll maybe take a look at that one, and see if we can tack on some others as well. But that's going to do it. Thanks for tuning in. As always, check out the Patreon, patreon.com/thefirst3, and we'll see you on the next one.